Elena Deladon or he was whomever, right? And just knowing tendencies and playing personnel, you could tell that he had a really high basketball IQ. And then when I brought him, with me at Vanderbilt, we would always talk X's and O's. I mean, we'd be watching games and texting back and forth, just different things that we saw. And our mindset is very similar in terms of what we look for out of our action. And it's funny because I was talking to Lynn the other day, and it's, you get to a point in coaching where it's like you're ready to hand that off to somebody else. And that's the thing that I love about the game. But where we are collectively, being able to hand that off to him, I trust him implicitly. He's really good at all that stuff.
Something is happening inside the Indiana Fever organization that nobody is supposed to know about yet, and the fact that you're hearing about it right now means the walls are already starting to crack. Think about that for a second. The most watched franchise in women's basketball history, carrying the weight of a cultural revolution on its shoulders, and somewhere beneath the surface of those bright lights and sold-out arenas, something is quietly coming undone. But here's what makes this story genuinely unsettling. It didn't start with a blowout loss. It didn't start with a public argument. It started with 7 words spoken calmly into a microphone by a head coach who probably didn't realize the entire basketball world was hanging on every syllable. 7 words. And once you hear them in the right context, you will not be able to unhear them. So stay with me, because what unfolds from here is not just a sports story. It is a story about power, identity, and what happens when the unstoppable force of generational talent collides with the immovable object of institutional resistance. Caitlin Clark arrived in Indiana like a lightning bolt wrapped in a number 22 jersey, and from the moment she stepped onto that court in a Fever uniform, everything changed. The arenas changed. The ratings changed. The entire economic landscape of the WNBA changed overnight. Sellouts became the new normal. Cameras that had never pointed in this direction were suddenly pointed everywhere. Little girls in Iowa, in Indiana, in places that had never once tuned into a WNBA game were now watching, learning, dreaming. What Clark built in college, that magnetic pull, that electricity she generates just by touching the ball, it didn't disappear when she turned pro. It intensified. She came in, and she was extraordinary, but extraordinary wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next. Because when you bring that level of talent, that level of attention into an organization that was already mid-construction, mid-identity, mid-everything, the tension doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you look around and realize the whole structure is tilting and nobody can agree on how to straighten it. So, watch the press conference again. Watch Stephanie White standing behind that podium, navigating a minefield of questions, and listen carefully when she says it. You get to a point in coaching where you are ready to hand that off to somebody else. On paper, she was talking about her assistant. She was praising Austin Kelly, talking about his basketball IQ, explaining how she trusts him to draw up plays in high-pressure moments. That's the surface-level reading. That's the answer everyone accepted and moved on from. But coaches don't casually talk about handing things off in the middle of the most scrutinized season in the history of their sport. That's not how language works in high-stakes environments. Every word in a press conference is deliberate, filtered, chosen. So either something slipped out that wasn't supposed to, or something was deliberately planted in the conversation for a reason. And both of those possibilities are deeply interesting. Now, before you dismiss this as overanalysis, consider the broader picture that was already taking shape before that press conference ever happened. Reports had been circulating, quietly at first, then louder, about friction inside the locker room. Not the kind of friction that makes teams better, not the kind that sharpens edges and builds championships, but the quieter, more corrosive kind. The kind that shows up in body language, in sideline glances, in the invisible wall between a coach and her star player that nobody officially acknowledges, but everyone in the building can feel. And look, Stephanie White is not a villain in this story. She is an intelligent basketball mind who has dedicated her life to this sport and was handed an almost impossible assignment. Because coaching Caitlin Clark in 2024 is not just coaching a basketball player. It is managing a media empire, a cultural moment, an entire generation's hopes, while simultaneously trying to run a team full of veterans who were here before the cameras arrived and will still have careers when the spotlight eventually moves. The veterans matter. Kelsey Mitchell matters. But here is the brutal truth that the Indiana organization has been slow to fully reckon with. When you draft a player who fundamentally changes the sport, you cannot simply slot her into an existing system and expect magic. You do not hire a new architect and then force them to work inside a building you already designed. You hand them the blueprints, and you let them create. The motion offense that the Fever have been running is not inherently bad basketball. In a different era, with a different roster, it might be excellent basketball. But Caitlin Clark is not a motion offense player. She is a chaos artist. She is a floor general who processes the game at a speed that most players don't reach until their 6th or 7th season. She doesn't need screens and sets and methodical execution. She needs space, pace, and freedom. She needs to push in transition. She needs to make the defense react to her, not the other way around. Think about the fastest car ever built. Now imagine handing those keys to a driver and then telling her she cannot go above 40 miles an hour because the other passengers aren't comfortable at higher speeds. The car doesn't get slower. The frustration just gets louder. And the numbers, when you actually sit with them, paint a portrait that is simultaneously impressive and quietly devastating. Clark scores 25 points and the highlights flood the internet, and everyone says it was a great performance. The casual viewer sees 25 and thinks dominance. But anyone who watches her for more than 10 minutes understands that 25 in this system is not her ceiling. It is not even close to her ceiling. It is what happens when an elite scorer is operating at 60% of her capacity, constantly adjusting, constantly compromising, constantly playing around the edges of a system that wasn't designed to let her breathe. The scariest part? That gap between what she is producing and what she is actually capable of producing. That gap is not small. And somewhere in the back of every honest conversation happening inside that Indiana organization, everyone knows it. But knowing a problem and solving a problem are two very different things, especially when solving it requires admitting that the current approach isn't working, and that admission has names and faces attached to it. Then comes the physical reality of what Clark endures every single night, and this part of the story is the part that should be making people genuinely angry. The targeting is systematic. Defenses don't just guard her, they hunt her. Every possession, from the moment she crosses half court, someone is in her space, grabbing, bumping, redirecting, doing everything short of actually stopping her, because stopping her isn't really possible. What is possible is making her uncomfortable, making her work twice as hard to get to her spots, and absorbing whatever penalty comes as a result, because apparently the penalty is minimal. 0 free throws. In a game where she is the primary offensive weapon. In a game where she handled the ball more than any other player on the floor. Not one trip to the free throw line despite being physical enough and impactful enough to draw contact on virtually every drive. That is not basketball. That is a message. And the response from the sideline, from the coaching staff in those moments, has been the loudest silence in sports. Great coaches in high-stakes moments become shields. They absorb the heat, so their players don't have to. They take the technical foul. They make the referee uncomfortable. They stand between their franchise player and the aggression aimed at her, not because it always changes the call, but because it tells the player something more important than any timeout speech ever could. It tells her she is not alone. And right now, the question swirling in every honest corner of the WNBA universe is whether Caitlin Clark feels alone. Not abandoned, not disrespected, but alone in the specific way that matters most in competitive sports, which is the feeling that nobody on that sideline is as outraged on her behalf as they should be. Then the press conference happened again, this time in a different context, and this time the words were even more revealing. When reporters pressed Stephanie White about the swirling reports of internal division, she didn't deflect. She didn't pivot to talking about the next game. She went on offense. She blamed social media. She called out bots and misinformation. She demanded that legitimate journalism be practiced before questions like that were asked in her arena. And look, she's not entirely wrong. The internet does manufacture drama. Accounts do push narratives that have no grounding in reality. That is genuinely true. But here's the thing about that kind of response. When a coach swings back that hard at a question about team unity, it doesn't end the conversation. It extends it. Because the natural follow-up isn't whether the reports are true. It's why the question requires that level of reaction. You don't bring a sledgehammer to a conversation you're not afraid of. You don't invoke media responsibility and call out bots when the story has no oxygen. You only fight that hard when some version of what's being discussed is close enough to reality that dismissing it calmly isn't an option. And then came the win against the Connecticut Sun, and for a moment, it felt like oxygen returned to the room. 10 points. A collective exhale. Proof, if you wanted proof, that the Fever could win games and silence the noise and move forward. But basketball tells deeper truths than scoreboards do. 19 turnovers in that game. 19. You do not accidentally commit 19 turnovers when your team is comfortable, connected, and executing with clarity. Turnovers at that volume are a symptom. They are what happens when players are in their heads, second-guessing, running plays that don't feel instinctive, trying to honor a system instead of trusting their instincts. A win that produces 19 turnovers isn't a sign of health. It is a team winning despite itself, which is impressive in a narrow sense and terrifying in a broader one, because that formula has an expiration date, and it usually arrives at the worst possible moment. So here we are, standing at what feels like a genuine crossroads. And the scenarios that are being discussed in the dark corners of basketball conversations right now range from uncomfortable to seismic. The first scenario is the one everyone wants to happen. The organization reads the room, makes the adjustments, redesigns the offensive system around Clark's strengths, and gives Stephanie White the tools to adapt rather than forcing her to defend a philosophy that isn't serving its most important player. That scenario exists. It is possible. Teams have course-corrected mid-season before and come out stronger for it. But it requires a specific kind of organizational humility that isn't always easy to access when the cameras are this bright and the stakes are this high. The second scenario is darker, and discussing it doesn't mean predicting it. It means acknowledging what happens when institutional inertia is stronger than the willingness to evolve. If the motion offense continues unchanged, if the physical targeting of Clark continues without consequence, if the locker room friction hardens into something permanent, then you arrive at a moment that nobody in Indiana wants to imagine. A conversation behind closed doors.